"Are you ready, class?" asked Mrs. Atwell, the teacher, as the children sat on the mat. "It's time to get out your..." She hiccuped. Sophie looked at Mrs. Atwell and looked at her best friend Meg, who gazed back at her. Sophie saw tiny dimples appear at the corners of her friend's mouth and felt a laugh inside. "Dee!" she tittered. "Ha!" squealed Meg. "Oh!" chortled Sophie as she tried not to laugh. She looked at Meg, who had a grin on her face and both hands clasped over her tummy. The laughter bubbled up in Meg and slipped and slid out her mouth. Sophie tried not to look at her friend or to listen to her. She put her hand over her mouth. She couldn't stop. The laugh swelled like a balloon. Soon Sophie and Meg were pointing at each other and laughing. Mrs. Atwell, who was writing on the whiteboard, heard laughter bubbling up from the back of the class. She turned around and saw Meg clasping her tummy and Sophie with her hand over her mouth. "What's so funny, you two?" she asked. The girls tried so hard not to laugh, it hurt. Sophie looked at Meg and saw her friend try to wipe the grin off her face, and then Meg gave up. She lay back on the floor, spread her arms wide, looked up at the roof, and roared with laughter. Mrs. Atwell frowned at Sophie and Meg. "You two stop that," she said. "Stop this instant," she demanded. And then her frown twisted into a grin, and she chuckled. She couldn't stop herself from laughing. "Sophie, Meg, stop She doubled up, bent over, and laughed her way around the room. Chad and Conway looked at Sophie, Meg, and Mrs. Atwell. "What's so funny?" asked Chad. He turned and looked at Conway and saw a grin on his friend's face. Conway tried not to laugh but couldn't help himself. "Stop!" called Chad, and he started. They were joined by Tama, Anahata, Mary, Joshua, Phoenix, Peneha, and Ruby. Soon all the children were bellowing on the floor as Mrs. Atwell, with a face red as beetroot, staggered around the room. Miss Winthrop, the teacher from room 2, poked her head through the doorway. "What's going on?" she asked Mrs. Atwell, who replied, "We can't stop There's too much noise. I can't teach my class," said Miss Winthrop. And she started. She laughed all the way back to room 2, and soon her class was laughing. Then rooms 3, 4, 5, and 6 began. Even Mrs. Waverley, the librarian, started. Laughter rippled through the school. "What's all this noise?" called Mr. Brandon, the principal, with an angry frown. Then his scowl turned into a grin. He disappeared into his office and slammed the door. He could be heard laughing louder than anyone. The bell pealed with laughter at the end of school. "Children, it's time to go," laughed the teachers. When the children went out the gate, they tried not to look at each other or listen to one another. They tried to keep their mouths closed, but giggles escaped from their lips. Some stopped laughing and bottled their laughter up only to explode. Sophie looked at Meg and saw a twinkle in her eye, and both girls started again. Chad looked at Conway when he got on the bus, and soon they were all laughing. Laughter spread through the village as the children went home. Sometimes the laughing died down, only to start again. When Sophie got home, her mother Maxine said, "Have you had a good day?" "Well, Mum," said Sophie, trying not to smile, "Mrs. Atwell said, 'Get out your..." Maxine looked at Sophie, who had dropped to her knees with laughter, and she joined in. When Sophie's dad, Hemi, came home, he heard Sophie and Mum laughing, and he began before he got in the door. That night, Ginormous laughs burst out in every home and street in the village. When Mrs. Atwell's husband Ra asked her, "How's your day been?" she looked at him and said, "It's been very..." The next day, Sophie's mum didn't go shopping because she kept doubling up with giggles. Dad got sent home from work early because he couldn't stop. He looked at Mum and collapsed on the couch. Sophie stopped chuckling for a moment. She rang Meg to see how she was, and all she heard was giggling on the other end of the phone. The next day, Sophie ran away and hid so she couldn't see or hear anyone. She hid behind a lamppost. That helped. But then she saw Meg walking by, and they started again. Mum couldn't order meat from the butcher. When she tried, she said, "Could I please have 4 pork chops?" The butcher replied, "That will be $10.63. Nearly a week passed, and everyone was still laughing. Sophie, Meg, Chad and Conway had sore tummies. It was hard to eat and drink. Sophie's dad sent a text to the hospital. "Help!" it read. The next day, ambulances arrived with doctors and nurses who wore earplugs and wouldn't look at anybody. Dr. Boson gave everyone earplugs. He said, "Everyone go and sit by yourselves. No one is to talk or look at anyone." The laughter began to fade. Soon there was almost silence. Only a distant bird could be heard singing. By the end of the afternoon, everyone sat quietly. From then on, that day was known as the great hee-hee-ha-ha, ho-ho.